podcast from Drew and Mike I think it's really cool, and that is what I wanted to say.
Two and a mic. Politics around the world hasn't suddenly become more complicated. The human experience hasn't suddenly leapt into a new universal reality. We breathe the same air, albeit more polluted. We speak the same languages. We see with the same eyes, and so on. In essence, we are today not significantly different to humans from 50 or 60 years ago. Yet there are differences. Perhaps it can be said we live at a greater speed. We gorge on more information of different types. We communicate with varied means, and we demand more from ourselves and others more quickly and without remorse. As we no longer have to wait for postal services to deliver letters and agreements, we stress at the seconds that tick past our fiber optic lifelines and glare into the void of 5G. Yet we have allowed this state of affairs to develop, and others have fueled it, encouraged it, and benefited from it. Each of our worries and fears have become amplified. What little we may have is taken from us not by invaders but by speeches. Our way of life is attacked not by superstates but by racist statements from domestic leaders. Our sovereignty has only ever existed in the mind, while we live in servitude to people who have always profited and who will now simply profit more and without restraint. Unless. From this vacuum of social interest, a political movement is breaking through, a movement which seeks to empower communities, minorities, young and old, to participate, benefit, live and enjoy everything that a safe, environmentally conscious and just and equal country can give. Alex from the Breakthrough Party very kindly came to speak with me to talk about his party's positive approach to bursting the Westminster bubble and including all of the UK in living better and happier. Thank you, Alex, for your time. I'm very happy to say that I'm joined here by Alex from the Breakthrough Party. Alex, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much for having me on. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, so there are a few people who probably are not necessarily from the UK that listen to this podcast. And so therefore they're going to read, okay, Breakthrough Party. So obviously they know this is politically associated in some way. Could you give a little bit of background then as to who the Breakthrough Party is and kind of where you came from?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a democratic socialist party that was basically formed to be a real alternative in British politics to Labour and the Conservatives. The party was actually something that I've been thinking about forming for quite some time, but it sort of came to a head during the global pandemic. I think I'd been furloughed from my job. I was sort of sat at home, and you were seeing all the news stories roll in, like, you know, whether it was around corruption, whether it was around, like, you know, the care home deaths and so many awful things that were happening under Tory rule. It was very difficult not to be politically engaged during that time. And then I think on top of that, you then had Labour offering very little opposition, providing no real alternative. And I think that was, you know, frustrating me quite a lot. And I think it just all came to a head in the summer. I think it was the summer of 2020. And I went, you know, I had a group chat with a few friends on WhatsApp. And we were sort of talking about, like, why hasn't anyone created an alternative? Like in the UK, when you look at like what parties exist on the left at the time, especially, there wasn't that many, especially like none that I think offered that sort of sense of hope and was a bit more like modern in its thinking as well. So I think I just started looking into it, and, you know, day by day I was like, actually, I think I can do this, and I started building up that confidence to do it. Went through all the process, and then, you know, it was January 2021 that we officially registered as a political party, and like the rest is history, really.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell from your social media presence that there's quite a following. And I mean, in fact, that's where I came across the party first. And as we kind of quickly spoke a bit earlier as well, even when the the party line was to be critical of a certain kind of government decision, there was such this element of positivity within the messaging that came through. And you say, I mean, that is a deliberate approach, isn't it, of your party?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really, really important. Like I've come into politics quite late into my life. You know, I'm 32 now, but like I'm quite new to politics. I wasn't like a trade union. You know, my dad wasn't like a trade unionist. I wasn't going along to loads of different protests. I wasn't politicized in my youth. So for me, I'm coming into this quite fresh faced, and I wanted to do something a bit different with what we're trying to achieve as a party and offer that sort of fresh perspective, I guess, because I think what frustrates me most about politics, and I think frustrates a lot of people about politics, is essentially just two parties, three parties, whatever, just criticizing what the other one's doing, and that's all well and good. Like there's a lot of flawed politicians and a lot of flawed political parties in the British landscape, at the very least. And that's all well and good. Like we have to be ready to call out people when they're wrong, call out policies or call out certain bills or acts that are really horrendous. But you do need to offer that sort of sense of hope, because I think people need that right now. I think when you just see the news like day after day and you're just seeing another bleak story after another bleak story, and things are tough, right? Like things are really tough right now. Like when we talk about all the issues in the UK, like around cost of living crisis, around our crumbling public services, the NHS is on its knees, and the climate crisis as well, which is probably the biggest threat to not just the UK but the rest of the world as well. And we want to like take people away from that and go, okay, like these are massive issues and we need to absolutely highlight them and say like these are problems, but we also need to provide solutions. And I think from the manifesto that we put together, we've been able to sort of identify those problems and identify the solutions as well. We're really fortunate that like a lot of people really love the ideas. Now we need to go that next step with the manifesto and sort of show people how this looks in practice. But yeah, it's absolutely, yeah, in terms of our messaging, yeah, that's definitely something we try to do and offer a positive spin on it, because yeah, I'm myself just absolutely sick to death of just seeing like slogging matches between the Labour and the Tories, just like just offering no real alternative. It's just criticizing each other, and it's just gets a bit boring as well, like beyond just actually making you feel a bit a bit drained. It's also quite boring. And so we want to offer something a bit new, and hopefully like with our ideas a bit radical as well.
Yeah, definitely. And when you mentioned the manifesto there as well, we should also highlight the website, and I will put the address of the website, but it is breakthroughparty.org.uk. And I'll put that also in the episode notes. But just mentioning some of the things that you mentioned there, the element of positivity. I'm not familiar with any other party where they put up their policies so openly. Because I mean, if we remember in previous elections, when politicians are asked, okay, so what's your policy on this? Well, it's on the table, okay, but what's your policy? What's your approach? And they're not really very forthcoming, are they? But you've put so much out there, and on top of that, you've given people an opportunity to essentially click on something, and thereby registering an interest. So other people can also see which particular elements of these policies in specific categories are proving popular. I mean, this level of openness, transparency, and so on, it's extremely refreshing.
No, thank you. Like, I think it's really important. Like, we want, I think from what we've seen over these last, since we formed the party, the level of scrutiny of smaller parties is actually much larger than the more established parties. Like, we when we first started the party, we had 10 core policies, because we didn't want to release anything more than that, because with our process, like for developing policy, it's member led. So ultimately, like if the members don't want the policy breakthrough to adopt a policy, we don't adopt it. It's simple as that. So they, our members do the research, they come up with the ideas, they then hold these debates and discussions with the rest of the membership, and then we vote on it. And it's really as simple as that. And we offer that, total like democratic process. And then when we do, get round to publishing these policies, as you say, on the website, we want to see what people think, and we're really keen on that. And I think transparency in politics is pretty much non-existent. As you know, we just find out stuff through leaks. That's kind of what happens. And you know, not only that, but then also you have this, you know, sloganeering. Like, you know, people will come up, you know, with the Tories in 2019, it was get Brexit done. You know, Starmer has had so many different slogans over the last 2 to 3 years. Like, I've actually lost track of those relaunches. And you know, I think there just comes a point where it needs to be more, like, politics needs to be more than just vibes. And I feel like at the moment politics is just a vibe. Like, there's no real substance to anything that anyone says. And that's why we want to be really crystal clear. Like, this is what we stand for. Hopefully you like it. Like, there'll obviously be people that won't. Like, you know, we accept that. But I think there'll be a hell of a lot more people that likes what we do than those who don't.
Yeah, and also an additional observation on my side from what you say is, lots of politicians go down this route of considering themselves brands, this kind of commercializations of their image and so on. And that kind of cheats the people from exactly what they are. They're not brands. Yeah, I don't walk into the shop of politics because I want to purchase a Labour pair of shoes or a Conservative tie. You know, I want people to represent the interests of the country and the community. And clearly, you don't have this branded vision. You have policies. So you're saying this is who we are. And I think that's also a very brave step, isn't it?
I think in this age of politics as well, it's tough, right? Like, it's very, very tough. Like, you know, we're living in an age of personality politics and populism, where when, you know, at the 2019 election, it was between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, and that was what it was talked about. It wasn't talked about what you know, because I think if it was based on policies, I think we'd have seen a very different result. And this is the thing, is like, you know, people, when we talk about like how elections are won now, it's mainly done on personality, and it's done on like very like clear like pledges or certain like slogans or whatever else. It's not actually like meat on the bones, as it were. So there has to be a fine balance. It's so tough, and it's the balance we're trying to strike at the moment, because we're being really open about our policies, and we're like, look, here we go, like, here's our 150 policies. That's only going to get bigger as well. Like, we're always growing and developing our manifesto. It's like a living, breathing document. We don't just go, okay, that's it, here's our manifesto, because things change, right? Like, things will change, but we will communicate with people when those things do change and go, okay, well, we might have this policy now, but that policy will now slightly alter because this has happened, and be really honest about that, rather than, like, you know, when we look at, you know, for example, the 2019 Tory manifesto, so many things have not happened, you know, so many things they haven't filled up, you know, like the new hospitals, for example. But then also you can say to Labour as well, Keir Starmer and his leadership pledges, all of them have been abandoned, all 10 of them been abandoned. And, you know, that was down to apparently the war in Ukraine and COVID. And if anything, you need more radical policies than you did before once these things have happened. So none of it holds up. And I think what we're trying to do, as I say, is trying to offer that real, like, clear transparency. This is what we're about. This is where we're going. And just be honest with people. I think like that is what the very least politicians and political parties should be doing. And it needs to go beyond personality. Like, we see it on the left as well. Like, there are parties on the left that do have that messianic figure, and like everyone's looking to that person for, you know, looking for that person to lead them into, you know, into socialism, or, you know, and we need to get past that. It needs to be about the policies. It needs to be about ordinary people, like, taking that power back from the super rich. And it can't be done, you know, a single figure can't do that. Single figure can inspire, absolutely, but like, I think it has to go beyond that person. It has to be all of us taking part in that, and actually, you know, bringing that power back. It has to be us as a collective that does that.
Mhm. Yeah, and in fact, which also brings me to another issue that I have with some of the populist voices, particularly on the right, but also by the lack of genuine response from the Labour front benches. When politicians come out and say, "What we'll have, you know, any kind of government except a socialist government," and so on, and they are, you know, this attempt to basically make anything socialist the enemy. And this really is kind of reflected in the minds of the electorate when they go to the ballot box. You know, one of the important things that people have to learn, it seems, is exactly who socialism protects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing, is like, the word socialism, you know, communism, Marxism, these terms have been absolutely bastardized by the British media and politicians, and we face quite a big challenge in terms of reclaiming those words and actually saying this is actually what socialism is, because I think it has just been fed into us over decades, really, and like probably since like the 1950s. I think it's been really, and it's just been supercharged into the 21st century, that socialism is a bad thing. When you actually look at, you see those, I don't know if you ever see those sort of memes of like, someone does like, oh, this is what it looks like, like when like supermarket shelves are empty, and say, oh, this is what it'd look like if we lived in a socialist country. And then it's like, that's in a capitalist country. That's happening right now in a capitalist country. It makes absolutely no sense. And I think we just need to like educate people. I think that isn't gonna, it needs to be taught in schools. Like I'd love to see that, but I think that the education system, I think, won't do that. So like in the meantime, as a party, we're looking to employ like a political education program. So we'd love to, not only educate our members, but take that out into communities and actually say that, okay, this is what capitalism is. This is what socialism is. This is what imperialism is. This is what this stuff means and how this impacts you. And I think, when you even look at the last general election, like people were really supportive of progressive policies. And that was really understated. And I think we need to like really show people that there is another way. And I think people are ready for something new as well. I think they really are. Like I think there was a poll the other day that I think there was like 61% of people that responded to the survey said they think there's a need for a new party, away from Labour and the Tories, to challenge them and offer a real alternative. And I think people are looking for that now. I think they're absolutely crying out for it. So for us, it's like, it's a really good time to exist and try and build really from there.
Yeah, and going through some of your policies, I mean, one of the things which comes through from what you're saying in general is the sense of unity, the sense of community, the sense of people working together and participating, and you've got a vision for community. And looking at some of the policies you've highlighted here, these are things which can only really benefit people, especially those who are perhaps underprivileged, the ones who are currently suffering the most from the consequences of the pandemic, and then thereafter the energy crisis and the cost of living crisis. The number of people that currently have to go to food banks, to be able to feed their families, is a disgrace. Especially when you consider how wealthy the UK is as a country. And so many of your policies here are just realistic, practical ways that communities can extricate themselves from that kind of destitution, really, isn't it? It's wonderful.
No, thank you. Like, no, that's absolutely what we're trying to do. And I think that's the issue in this country, is that like the poorest people in our society are just absolutely, have been just demonized by politicians and the media. And they're understandably like apathetic. Like I think that's the thing, is like people really like, do they really want to be like focusing on like drama that's happening in Westminster when they're thinking about where their next meal's coming from? You know what I mean? Like that's why I want us to get away from that sort of Westminster drama and be more about policies that can actually help people. And I think it has to be about producing that positive messaging. It needs to be saying like, look, these are how these things will benefit you. And what I'm hoping as well is what we can try, because that's a massive issue in this country, and I'm sure it is in other countries as well, is like the voter turnout. The voter turnout in elections, especially in like more deprived communities, is really like quite low. So there has to be that level of like, we want people to participate, but we understand why people aren't at the moment when you look at the current political landscape. So we want to, let's say, like, yeah, what we want to do with our manifesto and what we're trying to do as a party is totally rebalance society, essentially, in terms of like transferring wealth, ownership, power from the super rich to the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. And that's what Breakthrough Party government would look like, and that's what we want. And I think, as you said, I think our policies are quite like practical. They're not like I really don't believe they're utopian or pie in the sky. I think they're really like achievable. But like the issue is like no one in this country has none of the mainstream parties anyway have the political will to carry it out. And that's really upsetting, because like there's been a lot of focus recently about growth. Like, only if we grow, only if the economy grows, can we pull people out of poverty, which is just absolute nonsense. Like, it is total nonsense. So like we just need to get away from these things that we've been fed for so long, these narratives that we've been fed, and just say, like, ultimately we've got millions of people living in poverty. Like, what can we do to solve this? And it's very, and when you actually look at the policies, like the policies that we have, like, it's actually really simple how we can do that. There's lots of different ways we can do that. Whether it's high minimum wages, maybe whether it's working public services that are like affordable or free where they need to be. These are just like, and in terms of like having a social security system that actually works, that brings people out, that can bring people out of poverty. Not just focus, because when you look at work as well, like the wages are so low, so you've got so many people that are in work poverty, a massive amount of people. So there's so many different things that we can do to change that. Even like one of our biggest policies, which is probably one of my favorite policies that we have, is around free public transport, which I think it would be an absolute game changer, not only like from a climate, when we talk about climate change and stuff like that, because that would be, getting less people using cars and everything else, but in terms of like social mobility as well. Like if everyone could access, so many people that live outside of like a big town or city centre who can access those amenities, access those opportunities and everything else, could just be such a massive step forward for society. And these are the kind of ideas that we think should just be front and centre of any progressive manifesto, and it's just missing from British politics. And I think that's, we're trying to bring that as a party and say, like, look, these are the ideas people should be adopting, and hopefully we can, as we continue building, we can make these actually, people actually start looking at these ideas and going, yeah, why aren't other people adopting these?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a definite power to the words and policies that you present. And what that would also hopefully do will be to inspire some of the other parties which are currently at the forefront to sort of reanalyze, reflect, and then perhaps take a step more towards humane policies rather than this fulfillment of corporatism and, sort of trying to essentially prop up the energy sector and the automobile sector and all of these sort of large, powerful conglomerates which don't provide any actual service to the community other than fulfilling the needs of their shareholders. But also your messaging is so consistent because even when, if people were to look at the manifesto from, I've got the community page open here, but if they were to look at also your policies on youth or your policies on education or your policies on economics and so on, there is a consistency to your messaging. You are putting communities at the forefront. You are putting the creation of opportunities and equal opportunities for all communities, right at the front, and you're giving communities the authority, as it were, to make decisions for their own benefit. And that's across the board in all of your policy categories, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We think it's so important. I think when you actually look at politics now, like there's a lot that's just sort of talked about in terms of party politics, which, we're a political party, so obviously there's gonna be that electoral element to it. But we think like politics really does happen in community, like, in communities, not only in communities, but like in workplaces, on the streets as well. And, for us, like everything has to stem from community. I think that sense of community and that sense of collectivism has just been ripped apart, totally torn away by the Tories over the last 4 decades. I think it was Margaret Thatcher that sort of like started building that idea of the individual, like looking after yourself, looking after your own sort of like your own home and looking after your immediate environment. But beyond that, they didn't really, don't care for your neighbour, don't look after one another. The state shouldn't be having to look after people. Like, you should be able to be self-sufficient and whatever else, and sort of driving home that narrative, that individualistic narrative. And I think we've got to take that back and say, actually, no, like so much good work and so much, I think as humans are like, we're social animals, right? And like we want to be in communities, and we want to be, we want to have that sense of belonging as well. And we want to try and bring, bring people together and say, actually, no, like you guys should be making decisions ultimately. Like the community, communities across the country should be making decisions about their own destiny, their own future. And I think, everything's so centralized now as well. That's a massive issue in British politics. It's all coming from Westminster. Like it's very top down. There is no level of autonomy or ownership that communities and people in those communities have. So I think like stuff like, I think one of our policies around community wealth building, I think is really, really important in terms of local services and, local services working like for the local economy and working for local people, and it all being retained in that community, I think is so important. And yeah, all of our policies, everything that we do is always built around community and how that will benefit people day to day, not just about like, pleasing. We don't want to, we ultimately know we're not going to ever be friends with corporations, large corporations and billionaires. Like, we know we're not going to have them as friends, and that's absolutely fine. Like, we want policies that basically will work for ordinary working people, those unable to work. We just want it to, we want these policies and this manifesto to appeal to them and to say like, look, change is possible and we can deliver it, and we're really confident that we could.
Yeah. And another pet sort of priority of mine is, as you've also mentioned, the environment, climate change, and addressing the issues, which is also one of these sort of big unifying platforms. And again, also a policy area which really attracts the young. I'm thinking of the inspiration provided by Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future, and I love to see young people getting involved in politics. I was at an Amnesty International event a few months ago, and the number of young people there who really took an interest in human rights, it really is empowering to see the youth of your society standing up and sort of raising their voices, isn't it?
Yeah, it's what gives me hope ultimately. Like I I sort of try and say, do I consider myself still young? And I probably, I don't know if I quite fall in that bracket anymore. But like, in terms of like young people coming through, like, I feel like when you look, I think there was like a survey done relatively, like, I think it was last year, around millennials at first, around how millennials aren't getting more right wing as they get older. They're staying left wing. And I think like you're going to see that not just in millennials, but in Gen Z and Generation Alpha as well. And like when you see these, young people that are like, as you say, like whether it's fighting for climate justice, social justice, racial justice, like you're seeing this in so many different like movements, trade unions, campaign groups, and hope, and actually the one area where you don't see a lot of young people at the moment is political parties. And I can totally understand why, because when you look at the policies that are being adopted by main parties, like what is there for young people? Like what is there for young people within British politics right now? What we hope is that young people will start looking at us, but like looking at politics and saying, actually, no, we want a piece of this. Because when you look at like opportunities for young people now, like I thought it was bad when I was, I grew up, well, sort of like my adulthood has basically been since the start of the financial crash. So I've never really known a time that was really normal. But like I feel like for the next generation, it's even harder. Like, you haven't only got like an economy that isn't working, but you've got, sky high tuition fees, like massive amounts of like the amount of rent that young people have to pay is extortionate, like absolutely shocking. So you've got a housing crisis, you've got, tuition fees, and you've ultimately got student debt. You've got, I think it's like the biggest like stagnation in like living standards, or biggest drop in living standards since the Napoleonic Wars. You've basically got, and then you've got climate, as you mentioned, you've got climate change, and you've got all these different crises coming together, and that's going to politicize you, right? Like if you're a young person, you're seeing all of that, that is going to politicize you, and it's going to make you want to get involved. And that's why we're seeing so many really inspirational young activists coming out of the climate movement, whether climate movement, trade union movement, feminist movement, and like around like racial justice as well, as I said. So it is really uplifting, and it's what gives me hope, because I think genuinely, like in the next 20 years, like if the likes of the Labour Party and the Tory Party don't shift with the times and change in terms of how they approach politics, they won't exist. Like they'll be very, very marginal niche parties, because I think society as we know it is changing, and politicians, I think, especially in the Tory Party, are trying everything they can to stop society changing, but it won't. Ultimately, like young people are the future, and they're gonna own own the future, and they're gonna own society. So they need to start in parties that are representative of them, and hopefully break through is that, that's what we like to think it is. I think it represents young people in a really positive way.
Yeah, and there is also this, we were talking earlier with regards to sort of, badges or labels given by especially right-wing politicians, and, this concept of being progressive, or, now in the last couple of years, they've started to attack woke and so on, without clearly understanding what the term means, nor indeed what the history of being woke means. How can you, because obviously you address the youth. Some of the problems, though, with regards to recent elections and referendums has been that old category. And you are very young, but clearly you're not, should we say, so young that you are not aware of, some of the difficulties of life, because you've obviously lived through considerable difficulties yourself already. How do you bridge that gap, though? Because an older person will look at you and say, oh, well, we're all so young. There is a language, isn't there, that you can convince them with of what you're saying for their benefit too.
Absolutely. I think there is and I think again, the political parties in the UK do play the sort of there is a generational divide, and they do play on that, especially around more social issues. I think they use that, we were talking about the culture war, and I think they try and flame tensions around immigration, around trans rights, and other issues like that. But ultimately, what it comes back to, and what it has to come back to with the older generation as well, is a lot of these people will have children, right? They'll have grandchildren, and it's about appealing to that and saying look, what do you want for your children and grandchildren moving forward? Do you want a society where you're not going to be well paid, you're not going to have any public services that work, privatized NHS, a costly NHS similar to the American healthcare system, a planet on fire? Are these the kind of things that you want for your children and grandchildren? Sounds really bleak, but you've got to be totally upfront and honest about it. Or do you want something different? Do you want something better for them? Because every generation up to this point has experienced an increase in living standards. I believe the millennials were the first generation in the last 100 years to not experience an increase in living standards. So that is a problem, and we're going to have that for probably further generations as well. And our older counterparts have been very, they've obviously experienced different crises, and we totally can't underestimate that. But ultimately, they've had a good time of it. I think younger people now coming through are going to have a much harder time of life, and we've got to appeal to that and say, look, this is the world that your children and grandchildren growing up into. Do you want that for them or not? I also think there has to be an element of messaging as well, around tailoring messaging. So when we think of who we're speaking to, if we're speaking to younger people, as you mentioned before, climate change is a massive thing, around women's rights issues, around racial justice. There's a lot of different issues that young people care more about than older people. Older people might be more thinking about the NHS, social care, community. I think community policy is quite massive as well, and sort of thinking about these things. So I think what we've got to do as a party is recognize that, and I think we do quite a good job of it, and saying look, ultimately these are the things that older generations stereotypically think about. I think that's the thing. There are exceptions to the rule, and I never would want to say because there has been a lot of rhetoric around the election, basically since Brexit election, where it's older people more likely to vote for Brexit, old people more likely to vote Tory, and yet these things are true, right? But there's a hell of a lot of older people that didn't vote for Brexit, and a lot of older people that didn't vote for the Tories. We got to recognise that. But ultimately, there's going to be certain things that will appeal to older voters, and as long as we communicate that effectively, then I think we'll be absolutely fine. But yeah, I think the core message for me has to be about appealing to those who have children, have grandchildren, and saying what is the future you want for them? Either what we have now, or do you want something different? And I think 9 times out of 10 they'd say they'd want something better for their children and grandchildren.
Yeah. British politics presents itself in a way that it's decisive, that it's quite flexible, because it's not burdened by this extremely complicated codified constitution and so on. And British politics tends to look at, for example, European political systems, where there are coalitions, essentially like here in Germany or in Italy and so on, and they consider these to be weaker government. I disagree, and I guess that there will be quite a few people who would also disagree because, hey, what's wrong with having a conversation with a politician who has a slightly different perspective and trying to work with them? But this is one of the reasons why in British politics this system of first past the post continues to rule the roost. Is it fair to say that one of your policy ideas is to introduce proportional representation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that has to be key, right? I think you made the point around Germany and like how like it's a coalition government, but like I think it's really representative of the voters, of people that vote. Like, yes, I think like with proportional representation, I think like one of the things gets used but a lot by people that are opponents of it is saying, well, like you could have like you could have far right parties that do get MPs, and I think that is the case. You could have a couple, but ultimately then it works the other way as well, right? Like we'd have more left wing parties that would have more seats and they would have more say. And I think ultimately if we want a truly a true democracy, I think PR has to be one of the founding principles of that. The issue that we have at the moment in the UK is that neither of the two ruling parties want PR because they know that as soon as PR is a thing, they will have to totally reshift how they work as parties. Not only that, I think they again would know that they don't have much chance of continuing. I think they play on the first past the post system, and it sort of encourages this. I think it encourages this attitude of like voting for the lesser evil. I think that's always what it comes down to in an election. When you're voting, you're kind of going, oh, okay, like there's no actual party that represents me, but this is the least worst option, so okay, I'll go for that. And it's led to this thing of as well around like tactical voting. So like again, that sort of like holding your nose, like sort of going, okay, I'll vote. Say for example, you're in a constituency where the Lib Dems are second place and you want them to beat the Tories, you'll vote Lib Dem because you want the Conservatives out. I want the Conservatives out just as much as the next person, but I don't want it to come to this idea that we have to just vote for the best person to get it out. I think there should be that level of fairness. Like when you think of like the last general election, I think the Tories got around 14 million votes, right? And they got 365 seats. So it's about like near 40,000 votes a seat, give or take, like very quick maths, but sort of like 40,000, I think. But then you like look at like other parties, like in the past there's been UKIP and there's been the Greens who get like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of votes and get one seat. Like how is that that just baffles me to say that that's like how could you say that's fair? So I think like by moving to PR, like ultimately to have a government that is much more representative of its citizens. And I think as well you'd get rid of that idea of having to vote for the best of a bad bunch, and you wouldn't be sort of caught in this endless cycle of centrist and right-wing political parties that just either like basically tinker around the edges, don't really change anything, and they just sort of take turns of managing power. Like that's just not a healthy democracy, and I think that PR is a massive step forward in sort of addressing that.
Yeah, and I also find it quite interesting because Brexit essentially came around because Farage and Boris Johnson and Gove, they kind of played to this sense of British sovereignty, be represented by your own principles and by your own institutions. And yet when it comes to voting systems, that same concept is not sort of brought over, is it? As in, when you have proportional representation, that is what makes your individual communities and regions better represented. But why don't people want to do that? Instead, we are perpetuating the Westminster bubble.
Oh, completely. And I think this is what I was sort of talking about earlier is like, I think we need to totally decentralize politics in this country. I think, like personally, like I really like the idea of similar to Germany, really, that federalist model. I think progressive federalism is, again, this isn't a party policy. This is just me speaking on a personal level. I think that is a really interesting model and something that I would like the party to explore. And I think just having people having more autonomy over their lives, I think we're just living in this age, when you look at even like Scotland as well, like the constitutional question about whether they leave the UK or not, it's like, again, like Westminster still control that. Westminster are blocking that and not allowing them to do that. That is not a normal democracy. And, ultimately, what we need to give I fully believe in the idea of right to self-determination. Like, I think that the people of Scotland should make the decision around their future. Like, I think that should be of any democracy, any nation. They should be able to do that. And the fact that the Westminster, that there's so much power that's been put into Westminster, and I think they're just trying to strengthen that power through some of the bills that they're trying to put through at the moment. They're just trying to solidify that power centrally, and they're not willing to. Because I think the thing is, as soon as they do let go of some of that power, I think you'd see a massive amount of change, and I think that scares them. I think that scares them massively. For these people, all it's about is about power. That's all it's about. It's not about making anyone's lives better. It's not about sort of bringing about the society, a society that would be great for their children and grandchildren. It's literally about power and making themselves richer, and that is it. That is the key motivation to why these people are in politics. Like, look at Rishi Sunak. Like the richest. I think he's the richest politician to have ever served as an MP in Westminster. I think he's very, very wealthy guy. It's like, why is he doing it? Why is he not on a beach somewhere or on like a super yacht just enjoying his life? And it's power. Like, it's literally power and about making him and his mates even richer than they already are, at the detriment of all of us. Trying to find ways to take that power away from Westminster and deliver it across all the regions of the UK of England, but then also to the nation, the nations at the moment of the UK, I think can only be a positive thing if it means taking power away from the likes of Sunak and co.
And also one final question, because you also touch upon some of the bills that have been introduced and have also been turned into acts. There is this fear that with some of the direction of these bills, I'm talking about the Police Act, where the police have been given more rights, where they can stop people without suspicion, they can refuse protests or limit the right to protest, and in general, human rights have been or are within the crosshairs of this government as well. These are worrying developments within a country that prides itself on being a democracy. But we are very slowly but surely seeing the dwindling of those democratic ideals. But people don't seem to be really aware of the dangers. How can you highlight these a bit more so that people really come to understand what potential dangers lie ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it sounds really simple, but telling them, like, making it really crystal clear that this is where we're heading, right? I think there's historical examples of this happening in other regimes, and we have to take lessons from history and say, like, look, these are the first things that happen, whether it's minimizing the power of trade unions, whether it's around stifling the right to protest. These are all things that have happened in countries in the past on this sort of road down to fascism. Like, this is the path to fascism. Like, 100% the UK is on that path. And we have to be really honest and upfront about that. And the issue as well is that we're going up against the most right-wing media in Europe as well, who are basically cheerleading this, like, who are very complicit in it. They're absolutely loving it when climate protesters are getting locked up, throwing soup at a painting. Like, I just find that absolutely baffling. But that's where we're at. So there's a hell of a lot we need to do, as well as calling it out. Like, we need to show people that there's another way as well. Like, it's all well and good us saying, like, guys, this is like the path to fascism. Like, be aware of this. And like, you really need to be aware of this. Is saying, like, well, what is the alternative? What is the alternative? What can we do? So I think we have to try and get on the front foot and present that alternative and say, like, look, like, there is another way, which means that communities have more of a say of how things are run, and they can take more ownership of those decisions and the money that comes into the community and everything else, and just saying, like, look, there is another way, and giving, I think, more democracy is the answer. Like, we don't want less. And I think the thing is, ultimately, this government, I don't think will rest until there's very little that we can do. I think even when it comes to voting, and the voting bill that went, I can't remember what the name of it was, but around the fact that we're now going to need voter ID to vote in the upcoming local elections and beyond. That's going to mean that millions of people, predominantly from like poor or marginalized communities, aren't going to be able to vote. They aren't even going to be able to have a say on who they elect into local government and into parliament. and that is terrifying, genuinely terrifying. And as part of the fight back, it needs to be telling people, but it needs to be providing an alternative. I think that has to be the absolute key to winning basically.
Yeah, and as you say, so local elections, and we've talked a lot about community, and that really comes out. So you're going to be putting candidates forward for local elections. Where can people go to see whether or not their local area has a candidate from you? And if there isn't one such, can people also then contact you and say, I'd like to stand?
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, we closed like the application process 2 or 3 weeks ago. We want to have the time, because I think this is the thing, like with our party as well, is what we're trying to do things differently, is like we're trying to, because there's some smaller parties that will sort of stand paper candidates where like they'll essentially say just sign up and stand, and you don't have to do anything or whatever. We're trying to sort of make it really clear to any candidates that stand for us that, like, look, there's a lot of work that's involved in this, and we try and be really upfront about that. So we've already gone through the candidate selection process. We have like a small handful of candidates that are standing, like I think we've got one that's standing in Cambridgeshire, got one that is standing in Basildon down in Essex. We've got one standing in Ashfield District Council. And we got one standing in Leeds City Council as well. So we only got the 4 candidates this year. But as I said, like we're quite clear with our candidates that there's a lot required, and we will give them all the resources and everything they need to stand. But there's a lot of work that goes into it. So that's our 4 candidates for this year. More than happy to provide it. If anyone wants any more details around those candidates and how they can get involved, just drop us an email at the info@email and the website that you mentioned before, and we'll more than happily give them more details. And if they want to help with the campaigns or anything else, we can give them those details for sure.
Wonderful. Alex, thank you very much for agreeing to come and talk with me. It's great to hear from you, and I hope if in the future you do come to sit in Downing Street, you'll remember me and come and say hi again.
I absolutely will. No, it's been an absolute pleasure. No, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Great. And all the best at the local elections. I may be back to have a chat with you after and see how that goes.
Please do. Love to. Thank you.